When Jay Gould died in 1892, he left an estate of some $72 million and a reputation so poor that newspapers competed to insult him in print. He was called the most hated man in America. He had also, quietly, built a great deal of it. This is Empires of Money, long, quiet histories of how the great fortunes were made and how they were lost, told slowly enough to fall asleep to. If you'd like the ledger opened again next week, the subscribe button is just below. Best to press it now, while the lamp is still lit. And yet, when you read the letters he wrote to his daughters, when you study the accounts of his intimate family life, you find a man who loved orchids and peace, who gave quietly to charities that would not publish his name, whose wife called him dear and meant it. A man who spent the final years of his life tending rare flowers in heated greenhouses, orchids imported from distant continents, fragile and precious and utterly useless for profit. A man who could speak gently to his children even as he orchestrated the destruction of his business rivals. A man whose servants said he was invariably polite, whose colleagues often said he was utterly cold. This contradiction is perhaps the most interesting thing about Jay Gould. This is the story of Jay Gould, the man who was hated almost as much for the times in which he lived as for the things he actually did. It is also the story of American finance in its adolescence, reckless, ambitious, without guardrails, learning the power of its own mechanisms, even as it shocked itself with the ruthlessness that those mechanisms permitted. To understand Gould is to understand the age that made him, and to understand the age is to glimpse the foundations of our own. Now close your eyes and listen. Dim the lamp, I'll keep the ledger. The history books sometimes suggest that great men are born to greatness, that the clay of their character is set early and hardens into the shape they will hold forever. But Jason Gould, everyone called him Jay almost from the start, was born weak, frail, a child whose parents must have wondered, in those first years, whether he would see adulthood at all. He entered the world on the 27th of May, in the year 1836, in a farmhouse set among the gentle hills of Delaware County, in a landscape of red barns and limestone and forests that had not yet been entirely cleared. His father was John Burr Gould, a farmer of modest means and moderate ambition. His mother was Mary, whose maiden name was Moore. The family line traced back to England, solid yeoman stock, people who worked the land and lived quietly within the rhythms of agricultural seasons. He was the younger son in a large family. His older siblings were already moving through the world, establishing themselves in trades or marriages. Jay was the unexpected one, the surprise birth that came to aging parents. And from the very start, his body seemed at odds with his circumstances. Fevers plagued his infancy, his lungs were tender. A cough that might be nothing in another child seemed to rack him, leaving him weak for weeks. The countryside around Roxbury was beautiful, but it was also harsh. Cold winters that lasted months, springs that came suddenly, summers of intense labor. For a child of frail constitution, the demands of rural life were considerable. His mother died when Jay was only 4 years old. The cause, by the standards of the time, was ordinary enough, an infection perhaps, or a sudden fever. But for a young boy, losing his mother was a rupture in the world. He spent the rest of his childhood in the company of a stepmother, as was common enough in those days. The stepmother appears to have been kind enough, though the surviving records give little sense of the relationship. What we know is that the boy was left largely to himself, with books and his own thoughts. The valley where he grew up was not poor exactly, but it was rural and it was small. The world was somewhere else. For a sick boy, and Jay remained sickly throughout his youth, subject to fevers and weakness that kept him indoors for weeks at a stretch, books became portals. He read obsessively, with the hunger of someone trying to escape his own skin. Mathematics especially called to him, geometry, trigonometry, the clean beauty of numbers and angles, their predictability and order. The body might betray you, numbers never would. By the time he was old enough to be apprenticed out, as was customary, his father arranged for him to work as a bookkeeper for a blacksmith in the village. This would have been when he was 14 or 15 years old. He kept the books with precision. He studied at night. He taught himself surveying, the measurement of land, the translation of territory into maps, the mathematics of ownership itself. When he was 16, he was offered a partnership in the blacksmith's shop, but Gould had already begun to understand something fundamental about himself. He was not a man for physical labor. His hands were delicate. His strength lay elsewhere. He sold his interest in the shop, and with capital he had saved or borrowed, the sources differ in various accounts, he moved to New York City to establish a surveying business. He was in his late teens. He had never lived in a city. He had barely lived outside Delaware County. What we know is that within a few years, this young man had taught himself enough to publish, in the year 1856, a volume titled History of Delaware County and Border Wars of New York. It is a learned work, careful in its research, attentive to detail. He had written it in the margins of his surveying work, in rented rooms, by candlelight. The book was not a commercial success, but it established him as something more than merely a boy with an eye for figures. It established him as a person who could think, who could research, who could organize knowledge into a coherent form. Some who knew him in those early years said that he was ambitious. Others said he was merely careful. Perhaps both are true. Ambition without method is usually short-lived. Method without ambition leads nowhere. Gould, even as a young man, seemed to possess both. The newspapers of the time, when they mentioned him at all, noted his youth, his unusual learning, his bookish manner. None of them predicted that he would become rich. None of them guessed that he would become famous. The sickly boy from Roxbury seemed set for a respectable but modest career, a small-town surveyor perhaps, or a clerk in some government office. That he would one day control entire railroad networks, that he would manipulate commodity markets, that he would be simultaneously loved by his family and despised by almost everyone else in the country, this was impossible to imagine. And yet the seeds were already being sown. The habits of mind were already forming, the ability to see a system, whether it was a ledger, a map, a railroad network, or a financial market, and understand instantly where its weaknesses lay, where its strengths could be leveraged, where the levers of control actually rested. This capacity, in a man with the nerve to act upon it, is the capacity to reshape the world. Gould had it. The question was only, what would he do with it? In the middle years of the 1850s, a man named Zadok Pratt was one of the most successful businessmen in New York. Not in the city, in the state. Pratt had built his fortune in tanning. He owned what was, at the time, the largest tannery in the world. It sprawled across a valley in the Catskill Mountains, a complex of vats and sheds and drying houses that could process hundreds of hides each day. The work was filthy and dangerous and essential. Every boot that marched, every saddle that was cinched, every glove that was worn, came from leather that had been tanned in such places, treated with tannic acid extracted from the bark of hemlock and oak, then worked and worked again until it became supple enough for use. Zadok Pratt was 45 years older than Jay Gould. He was successful, established, a man of property and reputation. Yet somehow he and this young surveyor, this thin, bookish young man in his early 20s, formed a partnership. The exact details of how this came about are obscure. Perhaps Pratt saw something in Gould that others missed. Perhaps Gould simply made himself useful, began by surveying Pratt's property or assisting with some calculation, and gradually became indispensable. What is certain is that by 1856, Gould had become Pratt's junior partner in the tanning business. The partnership took its name from the location, Gouldsboro. It survives to this day. For a time it seemed as though Gould might become a great manufacturer. He brought to the business the same methodical approach he brought to everything. He studied the chemistry of tanning. He improved the processes. He reduced waste. He introduced new efficiencies that Pratt, despite his decades of experience, had not thought to implement. A man who knew Gould during these years recalled later that he was tireless, that he seemed to work without sleep, that his mind was constantly turning over problems and arriving at solutions. Perhaps it was the tannery itself that didn't suit him. Perhaps it was the limitations of partnership with an aging man. Perhaps Gould simply began to see further than the Catskill Mountains. By the early 1860s, Gould had begun to invest in railroads. This was perhaps inevitable. The railroad boom was transforming America. Every entrepreneur with capital was investing in rail. A man with vision could see that the railroads were reshaping the economy, creating new towns, making fortunes. Gould began to accumulate shares. He began to study railroad finances as carefully as he had studied the chemistry of leather. In 1862, the Civil War was raging. The economy was turbulent. Stock prices swung wildly. It was during this chaos, a time when careful men sat tight and waited, a time when most investors were afraid to move, that Gould apparently made a series of investments in railroad stocks that proved badly misjudged. The sources are vague about the exact nature of his miscalculation. What is clear is that by 1863, Jay Gould had lost most of his money. He was bankrupt. The tannery partnership was dissolved. The young man who had seemed set for success was back to nothing. This was not an unusual occurrence in the 1860s. The financial markets were primitive. Information was slow to travel. A man who read the situation wrong could lose everything in months. Many did. Most men who experienced this kind of reversal either went back to working for wages or left the country entirely. But Gould did something different. He appears to have simply decided that the loss did not matter, that he would begin again, and that he would be more careful next time. There was something almost serene about this. No dramatic struggle, no visible despair in the letters and recollections that survive. Simply a recalculation and a restart. In 1863, the same year his bankruptcy was finalized, or nearly finalized, the records are unclear, Jay Gould married Helen Day Miller. She was, by all accounts, a woman of beauty and good sense. She came from a respectable family, one of some standing in New York society. She bore him 6 children over the course of their marriage, and by every account she loved him and remained by him through all of the scandal and controversy that would follow. His letters to her, which survive in small number, are tender and solicitous. He called her "My dear Helen," and in one letter, written from some distant city where he was pursuing business, he confessed that he missed her and the children, that the work of building fortune was tiresome, that he would prefer to be home. He wrote of his loneliness in hotels and railway cars, of the endless meetings and calculations that consumed his days. What was it, one wonders, that drew these two together? He was not handsome, he was not robust. He had just lost everything. He was a slight man of 30 years, thin as a rail, plagued by coughs and fevers, with nothing to his name but his intellect and his determination. Yet Helen said yes. She kept saying yes, through decades of controversy and suspicion and newspaper attacks on his character. Perhaps she saw something in him that the rest of the world did not see. Perhaps she was able to discern, beneath the careful exterior, a core of genuine feeling. Perhaps she saw only the man he was at home, in the privacy of their rooms, and believed that person more real than the figure who moved through the financial newspapers and the courtrooms and the railway offices of America. Whatever her reasons, she remained loyal to him, bore his children, managed his households, and gave him, perhaps, the only kind of peace and belonging he ever really knew. Their marriage lasted until his death. By all accounts, she never wavered in her devotion. After his bankruptcy, Gould needed capital. He was not a man of means. He could not simply wait for his fortune to rebuild slowly through prudent investment. He needed a way to leverage what remained of his ability and knowledge into something larger. Wall Street provided it. In New York, in the 1860s, the stock market operated on principles that would seem almost absurd to a modern investor. Information asymmetry was extreme. A railroad might issue stock whose value bore only the most tenuous relationship to the actual earnings of the company. A man with inside knowledge could make fortunes simply by timing his purchases and sales correctly. Gould appears to have understood this almost instinctively. He began to move in circles where such information was trafficked. He became friends with a speculator named Daniel Drew, an older man who had made his fortune in cattle drives and railroad speculation. He became close with another named James Fisk, Jim Fisk, as he was known, a man of enormous appetites and theatrical instincts, utterly unlike the careful Gould in temperament, but somehow perfectly suited as a partner in schemes. The figure of Jay Gould during these years emerges from the record as curiously divided. In some accounts, he is a cold calculator, a man without sentiment, willing to betray anyone for profit. In other accounts, written by men who knew him personally, he is quiet, thoughtful, even reticent. He seems to have been happiest when working with figures and maps, when the complexity of a system could be reduced to something his mind could move around in. Personal relationships were more difficult. He had few friends. He seems to have inspired neither the admiration of his colleagues nor the affection of the general public. Yet he was not entirely isolated. His wife Helen provided companionship. He had business associates who worked closely with him and who, by most accounts, respected his intelligence, even if they did not particularly like him. It was around 1868 that Gould, working with Daniel Drew and James Fisk, began to acquire shares in the Erie Railway. The Erie was one of the great railroads of America, an important line connecting the East to the Great Lakes and beyond. It ran through some of the richest territory in the country. A man who controlled the Erie controlled the flow of goods and people across one of the most important corridors of commerce in North America. At the time, the Erie was controlled by a man named Cornelius Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt was in his 70s, the richest man in the country, a railroad magnate who had seemed almost invincible in his acquisitions. He had built the New York Central Railroad into a vast system. He had defeated competitors, bought out rivals, manipulated markets to his advantage. He wanted the Erie. What happened next was perhaps the most audacious manipulation of a corporate stock that had yet occurred in American history. It became known as the Erie War, and it would reshape the landscape of American corporate finance. Vanderbilt, operating with his usual confidence, began buying Erie shares. He believed that if he bought enough shares, he would gain control of the company, as was normal in such matters. He had the capital, the influence, and the audacity to do it. He had defeated everyone who had opposed him in the past. Why should this be any different? But Gould and his partners had a secret weapon. They knew something that Vanderbilt did not, or at least they acted on the understanding that the law was far more malleable than it appeared. The Erie Railway, like most railroads, had the authority to issue new shares. Normally, a railroad issued shares only when it needed capital for improvements or expansion. But what if the company issued shares continually, at will, far beyond any rational relationship to the actual assets of the company? What if, every time Vanderbilt bought a block of shares, the company simply created more shares out of thin air and offered them to Gould and his partners? Vanderbilt would be trying to drive up the price of a stock that could be infinitely diluted. He would be emptying his pockets, trying to grab hold of something that could never be grasped. This is precisely what happened. As Vanderbilt accumulated shares, the Erie management, which was controlled by Gould and Fisk and Drew, simply authorized new issuances. Printing presses ran day and night, producing share certificates by the thousands. The stock was watered, in the terminology of the time, diluted beyond reason. And yet Vanderbilt kept buying, convinced that at some point he would achieve control. His advisors were reportedly appalled, but Vanderbilt, in his old age and secure in his long history of triumph, apparently trusted his instinct more than their counsel. The battle raged through the latter part of 1868. At one point, Gould, Fisk and Drew, fearing that Vanderbilt would use the courts to stop the new share issuances, fled New York entirely. They took refuge in Jersey City, across the river in New Jersey, where Vanderbilt's reach was less absolute. They brought with them, it is said, the company's share certificates and the company records, all the physical evidence of their control. Boss Tweed, the notorious political leader of New York City, appears to have helped mediate the dispute, apparently for a substantial fee. The whole affair had the quality of a kidnapping, or a elopement, or a war between sovereign powers played out on a smaller scale. Eventually, a settlement was reached. Vanderbilt agreed to purchase the Erie shares that Gould, Fisk and Drew had accumulated at a price of $120 per share. This was significantly above market value, but it was cheaper apparently than continuing to pour money into an endless competition for control. The total cost to Vanderbilt was approximately $4.5 million, It was a stunning defeat for the old railroad magnate. For Gould and his partners, it was an equally stunning victory. They had not only survived the onslaught of the wealthiest man in the country, they had profited from it. The Erie War was not merely a financial dispute. It was, in many ways, a battle over the very nature of corporate law in America. Could a company simply issue unlimited shares at the whim of its board? Could a handful of men essentially steal control of a company from another, using nothing but creative interpretation of accounting rules and liberal applications of bribery in the appropriate quarters? These were not abstract questions. They went to the heart of what it meant to own property in the new industrial America. Gould and his partners, particularly Fisk, who was far more theatrical and public than the careful Gould, had demonstrated that the rules could be bent, and bent far beyond what any reasonable person might have imagined. The newspapers responded with outrage. The public, to the extent that it paid attention to such matters, was disgusted. And yet, Gould in particular seems not to have registered these reactions as particularly significant. He had won. He had taken control of the Erie Railway. That was what mattered. The opinions of journalists and the general public were, in his view, irrelevant to the question of economic reality. What is striking, in retrospect, is how little the Erie War changed American corporate law. There was no great legislative response. No new regulations were imposed. The stock watering that Gould and his partners had engaged in was arguably illegal, yet they were not prosecuted in any serious way. Gould appears to have understood something about American society that many of his critics did not, that wealth itself was a kind of immunity. A poor man who engaged in fraud would hang. A rich man who engaged in the same fraud would be criticized in the newspapers, perhaps, and then forgotten. For the next few years, Gould and Fisk ran the Erie together, though it is clear that Gould was the senior partner, the man with the actual vision for the railroad, while Fisk provided the theatrical energy and the political connections. They made improvements to the line, they upgraded equipment, they extended the network. They also extracted value from it, as most railroad men of the era did. It was during these years that Gould began to accumulate wealth at a rate that would soon make him one of the richest men in America. The Erie had become profitable, not because of great demand for rail service, though there was that, but because Gould had managed its resources with such precision that it generated wealth even in difficult economic times. The partnership between Gould and Fisk was an odd one. Fisk was gregarious, flamboyant, interested in theatre and spectacle. Gould was quiet, retiring, interested only in numbers and systems, yet together they seemed to function well. Fisk would provide the visible face of the railroad, giving interviews to the press, attending social functions, becoming known to the public. Gould would work behind the scenes, moving pieces on the board with mathematical precision. It was a division of labor that worked, at least for a time. But his time with Fisk was not infinite. On January 22nd, in the year 1872, James Fisk was murdered. He was shot by a man named Edward Stiles Stokes over a matter involving a woman and a hotel. The shooting took place in a New York hotel, in broad daylight, in a manner almost theatrical enough to have been orchestrated by Fisk himself. Fisk was 40 years old. He died within hours. His funeral was spectacular. The entire city seemed to mourn him, or at least to pause to watch his passing. It was the kind of dramatic exit that Fisk himself would have appreciated. Gould's response to Fiske's death, according to those who knew him, was relatively muted. He did not speak extensively about it. He did not rage or despair. He simply moved on to the next thing. This was the quality that distinguished him most sharply from Fiske and from many other men of the era. Sentiment was a luxury. Gould could not afford it. Whether this was a strength or a deficiency is perhaps a matter of opinion. Some who knew him regarded this coldness as admirable, the mark of a man who could keep his emotions separate from his business decisions. Others regarded it as profoundly inhuman, evidence of a deficiency in his character, a missing piece in his moral makeup. Fiske's death, or perhaps the growing unpopularity of Gould's control of the Erie, led to a shift in power within the railroad. By 1872, Gould had been forced out of his position of control. He no longer ran the Erie. This was presented in some accounts as a defeat, as evidence that even Gould could be removed if enough pressure was brought to bear. But Gould, as was so often the case, had already moved on to other things. He had made his profits from the Erie. He had learned what he needed to learn about controlling large systems, about stock manipulation, about the use of political connections to achieve business goals. The Erie War had been a masterclass in the exploitation of ambiguities in corporate law and in the deployment of political influence to achieve financial ends. It had demonstrated, beyond any doubt, that in the new industrial America, the rules could be bent if you had money, intelligence, and the willingness to bend them. The public had been shocked and outraged. Reformers had called for legislation to prevent such abuse, but little changed. The system remained as malleable as ever, and Gould had proven himself a master of manipulation. There was no reason to linger with the Erie. The railroad had served its purpose. It had been a vehicle for wealth accumulation and a school in the arts of corporate control. Gould had graduated. Time to move on to the next opportunity, the next system waiting to be understood and exploited for profit. In the autumn of 1869, Gould conceived of another scheme, one that would demonstrate both the brilliance of his financial understanding and, to many observers, the depths of his moral indifference. The scheme involved the gold market. In the years after the Civil War, the United States Treasury held large quantities of gold. This gold was the ultimate store of value. Most economic activity in America depended, in one way or another, on the gold standard. The price of gold was allowed to fluctuate in the free market, creating opportunities for those who could correctly predict where the price would move. If Gould could corner the gold market, that is, if he could accumulate enough gold so that he controlled the supply, he could drive up the price to whatever he wished. Those who had sold gold short, expecting the price to fall, would be forced to buy it at his price or face ruin. To accomplish this, Gould needed three things: capital, inside information, and an absence of moral scruple. He had the first two in abundance. As for the third, well, that had never been a problem for him. The inside information came through a man named Abel Corbin. Corbin had married Virginia Grant, the younger sister of President Ulysses S. Grant. Through Corbin, Gould believed he could influence the president to keep government gold off the market, thus restricting supply and driving up the price. Whether Corbin was a willing participant in the scheme or was simply unaware of the use to which his access to the president was being put remains unclear. It is possible that Gould simply cultivated a relationship with Corbin, shared a vision of the future price of gold, and allowed Corbyn to draw his own conclusions. Gould was talented at creating situations where other people's interests aligned with his own. In the summer and early autumn of 1869, Gould and his partners, particularly James Fisk, began quietly accumulating gold. They moved carefully, trying not to drive up the price too quickly or too obviously. But as their holdings grew, and as word began to spread through the financial markets that someone was accumulating gold in unusual quantities, other speculators began to join in, betting that the price would rise further. The gold price climbed day by day, week by week. By mid-September, the price was rising sharply. Newspapers began to investigate. Rumors of a gold corner spread through Wall Street. The entire market was becoming focused on the question, who was behind the accumulation? Then on September 20th, Gould and Fisk began buying aggressively. They wanted to corner the market entirely, to own so much gold that no one else could move the price without their permission. For several days it seemed as though the scheme would work perfectly. The gold price soared. Speculators who had bet on a rising price were making fortunes. The newspaper headlines screamed about the gold corner, about the conspiracy to corner the market, about the sinister machinations of Wall Street. Some papers even hinted at scandals involving the president's brother-in-law. The city was in uproar. But on September 23rd or 24th, something happened. Corbyn, according to the accounts that survive, warned Gould that President Grant had become suspicious of the gold accumulation. Grant, it appeared, was about to order the Treasury to release large quantities of gold onto the market. This would flood the market, destroy the corner, and ruin everyone who had accumulated large positions. Gould had perhaps 48 hours to act. What Gould did in response reveals something essential about him. He did not panic. He did not try to hold the line. Instead, he appears to have quietly sold his entire position, exiting the market at prices that were near the peak. When the Treasury gold hit the market on September 24th, prices collapsed. Fisk and other speculators lost enormous sums. Some losses were in the millions of dollars, but Gould, with his characteristic caution and his insider warning, had already exited. He had profited handsomely. Once again, he had made money while others lost it. The day that gold prices crashed, September 24th, 1869, became known as Black Friday. It was not the first financial crisis in American history, but it was among the most dramatic and the most concentrated. Fortunes were made and lost in hours. Suicide rates among speculators are said to have spiked in the days that followed. The press was apoplectic. They blamed Gould. They blamed Fisk. They blamed President Grant for his mishandling of the situation. And yet, once again, Gould was relatively insulated from serious legal consequence. He had not technically done anything illegal. He had manipulated the market, certainly. He had used inside information, certainly. But these were not yet defined as crimes in the 1869 legal code. The Gold Corner scheme revealed a terrible truth about financial markets, one that remains pertinent to this day. It is possible for an intelligent person with access to information and sufficient capital to move markets in ways that harm ordinary people. And while the consequences might be painful, the penalties for the schemer are often minimal. Gould had demonstrated this with crystal clarity. He was now one of the richest men in America, and he was now, it would seem, universally despised. In the years following the Gold Corner scheme, Gould's reputation did not improve. If anything, it darkened. The press had turned entirely against him. Every business deal he made was examined with suspicion. Every profit he took was portrayed as evidence of his rapacity. When workers went on strike on a railroad he owned, it was automatically assumed that Gould's actions had been the cause. When prices rose, it was attributed to his manipulation. When prices fell, it was his fault for failing to maintain the market. Much of this was surely unjust. Gould was not personally responsible for every rise and fall in the markets. He was not the cause of every labor dispute. The American economy in the 1870s and 1880s was undergoing rapid and often painful transformation. Agricultural prices were falling. Competition among railroads was fierce. Workers were organizing, demanding better conditions and higher wages. These were structural changes, products of deep economic forces far larger than any single man. And yet the press did not care much for nuance. There was a villain that the public wanted to believe in, and Gould fit the role almost perfectly. He was wealthy, he was successful. He was clearly willing to operate in ways that were at least morally questionable, if not clearly illegal. And he did not care much what people thought of him. He did not make grand public defenses of his actions. He did not try to rehabilitate his image through charitable works or public speeches. He simply kept working, kept accumulating, kept maneuvering. During the 1870s, Gould was involved in various railroad enterprises. He bought control of the Union Pacific Railroad at a relatively low price in the mid-1870s, and then sold it about 4 years later, around 1879, at a substantial profit. He acquired the Kansas Pacific and other lines. He was building what would become known as the Gould system, a network of railroads primarily in the South and Southwest. But even as his wealth increased, he was becoming more isolated. The respectable business establishment of New York began to exclude him from their circles. He was not invited to the important social functions. His name was not mentioned in polite society, except with a lowering of the voice and a significant look. His own family, his wife was loyal, but even some of his children seemed to regard him with a mixture of love and exasperation, understood that association with him carried a social cost. In 1881, Gould acquired a controlling interest in Western Union Telegraph Company. This was yet another demonstration of his ability to identify valuable assets and move quickly to consolidate control. Western Union was essential infrastructure, the network through which nearly all business communication flowed. For a man who understood systems as deeply as Gould did, controlling Western Union was almost as important as controlling railroads. He also acquired in this period the New York World newspaper, one of the most important newspapers in the country. Owning a newspaper seemed to carry for Gould the same logic as owning a railroad. It was a system, an infrastructure of sorts, a way to move information through the public mind, the way a railroad moved goods through the landscape. He owned it briefly, but did not seem entirely comfortable in the role of newspaper publisher. The World was sold in 1883 to Joseph Pulitzer, who would make it into the most important newspaper in New York. Throughout all of this, Gould lived quietly. He did not display his wealth in the ostentatious manner favored by many of his peers. He did not build enormous mansions or throw lavish parties. He was small and spare, and seemed almost ascetic in his personal habits. He worked constantly, almost obsessively, reading railroad reports and financial statements late into the night. He suffered from chronic health problems. The fevers and weakness that had plagued him in childhood never entirely left him. By the 1880s, he was showing signs of the tuberculosis that would eventually kill him, though no one yet understood that this was the disease that was slowly consuming him. It was during this period that the question of labor began to haunt him, or at least to haunt his public image. The workers on the railroads Gould controlled were among the most overworked and underpaid in the country. Conditions in railroad shops were terrible, hours were long, wages were inadequate, safety provisions were minimal. When men were injured or killed, their families received no compensation. When workers attempted to organize, they were often fired summarily. In 1886, a major strike broke out on the Gould system, centered on the southwestern railroads. It was organized by the Knights of Labor, one of the first serious attempts to create a national labor organization. The strike was long, bitter, and ultimately unsuccessful. But the violence and suffering it caused became, in the public mind, associated permanently with Gould's name. Whether he was directly responsible for the brutal suppression of the strike is debatable, but he owned the railroads. His workers were striking. His reputation was not improved by their suffering. It was during this period, or shortly thereafter, that a quotation began to circulate, a quotation attributed to Gould, in which he supposedly said that he could hire one half of the working class to kill the other half. The quotation was widely repeated, and it became one of the most damning of all the accusations leveled against him. The problem is that there is no clear contemporary documentation of Gould ever actually saying this. The quotation appears in various forms in labor publications from the 1890s, but the original source is unclear and possibly fabricated. Whether Gould said it or not, it became true enough in the public imagination. It became the perfect expression of how people understood him, as a man so utterly indifferent to human suffering that he would regard working people as interchangeable counters in his games of profit and loss. The Union Pacific Railroad held a special place in the American imagination. It was the railroad that had, in 1869, finally linked the east and west coasts of the United States. The moment when the Golden Spike was driven at Promontory Summit in Utah, joining the rails coming from east and west, had been treated as almost a spiritual event. Senators and generals and railroad executives had gathered in the wilderness to watch history being made, to see the moment when America became truly whole, when the continent was stitched together by iron rails. The Union Pacific was not merely a business enterprise, it was a symbol of American progress, of the country's ability to transform its vast landscape into an integrated whole. The railroad ran through deserts and mountains, through territories that had recently been battlegrounds in wars between settlers and native peoples. It was a monument to American expansion, American confidence, American faith in progress and industry. When Gould acquired control of the Union Pacific, he therefore became the keeper of an American icon. The public was not pleased about this. That a man so reviled, so clearly motivated by profit rather than patriotism, should control this important railroad seemed almost obscene to many people. The newspapers were scathing. How could this man, this speculator, this manipulator of stock and distorter of markets, be trusted with the railroad that symbolized American greatness? It was as though a sacred trust had been betrayed. Yet Gould appears to have understood, even more clearly than the public did, that the Union Pacific was indeed a symbol of American ambition and growth. To control it was to participate in something larger than personal profit. And unlike many businessmen, Gould seems to have taken seriously the responsibility that came with running the Union Pacific. He did not simply bleed the railroad for profit, as some had feared. Instead, he invested in it. During Gould's years with the Union Pacific, a period of roughly 4 years, from the mid-1870s to around 1879, he made significant improvements to the railroad. He invested in new equipment, modern locomotives and cars that could handle greater loads and travel faster. He expanded the network, adding branch lines and connections. He improved efficiency, reducing waste and excess. He reorganized the management structure, bringing in talented men who shared his vision for how the railroad should operate. These were not acts of charity. They were business decisions made by a man who understood that a railroad that was not constantly improving would eventually fail. But they also demonstrated that Gould was not merely a speculator, not merely a man of paper transactions and financial manipulations. He could actually build and improve things. He could take a system and make it function better. That this skill was deployed in service of his own profit did not change the fact that the skill existed. The sale of the Union Pacific around 1879 at a substantial profit demonstrated once again Gould's essential strategy. He bought undervalued assets. He improved them. He sold them when they had appreciated sufficiently. Then he moved on to the next opportunity. He did not seem to suffer from what most businessmen suffered from, the desire to hold on to acquisitions, to expand them indefinitely, to build empires that would serve as monuments to their success. Gould seemed willing to sell almost anything if the price was right. This gave him an enormous advantage in the market. While other men were attached emotionally to their holdings, while other men wanted to be remembered as the builders of great railroads or the founders of great corporations, Gould could see clearly what something was worth and whether it was worth holding. Sentiment had no place in his calculations. The money he made from the Union Pacific and his other railroad ventures during the 1870s and 1880s was enormous. By some careful estimates, by the end of his life, his wealth was somewhere in the region of $70 to $100 million. By other estimates, it was less. By some accounts, it was more. The exact figure was difficult to determine, in part because the value of railroad holdings could fluctuate wildly depending on market conditions and business prospects. But what was not in doubt was that he was among the wealthiest individuals in America. Only a handful of men had accumulated comparable fortunes. Perhaps 5 or 6 men in the entire country could rival him. He had achieved a level of wealth that placed him among the most powerful economic actors in human history. What is less clear is what he did with this wealth. The standard narrative suggests that he simply accumulated it, that he was motivated purely by the desire for accumulation itself, that the profit motive had completely consumed any other human interest. But this narrative does not entirely hold up to scrutiny. Gould gave to charity, though he did so quietly, and without the publicity that other wealthy men craved. He supported art and culture. He had a passion for orchids, and he built an orchid house on his property that was filled with rare specimens from around the world. He was a devoted husband to Helen, and later, when she died, he appears to have been genuinely grief-stricken. He was attached to his children and wanted them to be educated properly and to enter respectable society, which they did for the most part. None of this erases the reality of his ruthlessness or his indifference to the suffering he caused, but it does complicate the picture. Gould was not a one-dimensional villain. He was a man divided between different impulses: the drive for power and wealth, the desire for peace and beauty, the love of family, the hunger for respect from his peers. These impulses did not always point in the same direction, and the world he had to navigate did not accommodate the kind of person who wanted both to be a ruthless businessman and a cultivated gentleman. He was forced to choose again and again between these aspects of himself. More often than not, he chose ruthlessness. A man in control of a telegraph network is, in a real sense, a man in control of the flow of information through society. Every message sent, every transaction recorded, every communication between distant points passes through the infrastructure he owns. In the 1880s, when Gould acquired Western Union, he came into control of perhaps the most important communications infrastructure in America. This was, for him, even more significant than his railroads. A railroad moved goods and people across space. A telegraph network moved information, the lifeblood of commerce. In the modern economy that was emerging, information was perhaps more valuable than physical goods themselves. Gould understood, with an acuity that most of his contemporaries did not, that control of communications infrastructure was fundamentally different from control of other kinds of property. A railroad moved goods. It was important, but it was limited to the movement of physical objects. A telegraph network moved information. In the modern world, information is value. Whoever controls the wires controls, in some sense, the flows of capital and decision-making that move through the economy. When Gould acquired Western Union, the company had been in existence for decades. Samuel Morse, the inventor of the telegraph, had been instrumental in founding it. But by the 1880s, it was simply an infrastructure company, essential but not glamorous, required but not exciting. Gould saw something else. He saw a system that could be improved, that could be made more efficient, that could be extended. He invested in new technology. He expanded the network. He made Western Union more powerful, more reliable, more central to American business. There were competitors, of course. There were men and companies that wanted to break Western Union's monopoly on telegraph services. But Gould was not interested in competing on those terms. He was more subtle. He simply made sure that Western Union controlled the key routes, the critical junctions, the infrastructure that competitors would need to access if they wanted to offer service at all. He made himself indispensable. Around the same time, in 1881, Gould made a bid to acquire the New York World, the newspaper founded by Alexander Hamilton's son, James Gordon Bennett. No, that is not quite right. Gordon Bennett was not Hamilton's son. Gordon Bennett founded the Herald. The World was founded by Manton Marble, a politician and journalist. The point is that the New York World was one of the 2 or 3 most important newspapers in the country. It was the paper of record for New York. Whatever appeared in the world shaped how New Yorkers understood their world. Why Gould wanted to own a newspaper is unclear. Perhaps he wanted to control the narrative about himself and his businesses. Perhaps he saw the newspaper as simply another infrastructure business, another system to acquire and improve. Perhaps he wanted to participate in the shaping of public opinion, to mold it in ways that benefited his interests. Or perhaps, and this is possible, he wanted a newspaper simply because he liked the idea of owning one, because it seemed like the kind of thing a great man should do. But Gould proved to be a terrible newspaper editor. He does not seem to have understood, or perhaps he simply did not care about, the culture of journalism. A newspaper requires editors and reporters who have at least some independence from the ownership. It requires a kind of intellectual freedom that a controlling businessman often finds difficult to permit. Gould acquired the World in 1881, but by 1883 he had sold it to Joseph Pulitzer, a newspaperman of genuine talent and ambition. Pulitzer would make the World into the most important newspaper in America, but that transformation happened after Gould had sold it. The sale of the World was not presented as a failure, but it was revealing. It showed that Gould, despite his undoubted genius for acquiring and improving business systems, was not a man of the media, not a man interested in the subtle game of shaping public opinion through editorial choices. He was more comfortable with systems that were purely economic: railroads, telegraph networks, commodity markets. When the system became more cultural, more dependent on judgment and creativity and persuasion, Gould retreated. During the 1880s, as his wealth increased and as he approached middle age, Gould began to spend more time on his personal interests. He maintained his passion for orchids. He collected orchids from around the world and maintained them in carefully controlled greenhouses on his property. Visitors noted that he would spend hours among his orchids, apparently finding in them a kind of peace or beauty that he could not find elsewhere. The flowers were fragile, ephemeral, beautiful. They could not be bought or sold in the way that railroad shares could be bought or sold. They simply existed, and they could be admired or not. In a life devoted entirely to acquisition and control, the orchids represented something else, something closer to acceptance. His main residence during these years was a large house on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, where he lived with his wife and children. The house was imposing, but not ostentatious. He did not decorate it lavishly or throw enormous parties. Instead, it was a kind of fortress, a place where he could retreat from the world and its demands, where he could be with his family and his books and his various business enterprises. The front rooms looked out onto the avenue, watching the city move past, but the inner rooms were quiet and private. The greenhouse where he kept his orchids was separate, a world unto itself, a space devoted entirely to beauty and cultivation rather than to profit and calculation. The house on Fifth Avenue was neither small nor large by the standards of wealthy New Yorkers of the 1880s and 1890s. It was simply a house, a home, a place to live. But within its walls lived one of the most powerful and most hated men in America, and within those walls he attempted to create a kind of normalcy, a kind of domestic peace that the outside world would never grant him. Helen, his wife, was his anchor during these years. She had married him when he had nothing, when his bankruptcy had stripped him of everything. She had stayed with him through the Erie War, through the Gold Corner scandal, through all of the condemnation and contempt that the newspapers hurled at him. She bore him 6 children, 4 daughters and 2 sons. Several of the children would go on to be prominent in their own right, though none of them ever came close to matching their father's accumulation of wealth or power. The letters that survive between Jay and Helen suggest a relationship that was more than merely dutiful. He called her "my dear" and "my dearest." He confessed to her when he was tired or discouraged. He sought her counsel on matters of importance. When business took him away from home, as it frequently did, he wrote to her with what seems to be genuine affection. In a life devoted so thoroughly to the accumulation of power and money, she appears to have been his counterbalance, the one thing that was not contingent, not subject to market forces, not vulnerable to the machinations of his rivals. His children were educated carefully. They were sent to the best schools. They were taught languages, music, and the arts. His daughters married well, into respectable families. His sons went into business, though neither ever achieved the kind of success their father had enjoyed. In a way, this may have been a relief to him. He did not want them to inherit his struggles. He did not want them to feel the need to accumulate as obsessively as he had. He wanted them to be able to simply enjoy what he had built, to live gracefully rather than combatively. By the 1880s, Gould was spending less time in active business operation and more time managing his vast holdings. The days of dramatic acquisitions and spectacular coups were largely behind him. He had built his system. Now it was a matter of maintaining it, improving it where possible, extracting value from it. He suffered increasingly from health problems. The tuberculosis that would eventually kill him was almost certainly present, though it may not have been diagnosed. He tired easily. He could not do the kind of intense, sustained work that had characterized his earlier years. He also began to think increasingly about legacy, not in the grandiose sense that many of his contemporary magnates thought about it, commissioning enormous statues or endowing great public institutions with their names attached. Rather, he thought about what he would leave behind, what would become of his fortune, how his children and grandchildren would live in the world he had shaped. Some of his wealth was dedicated to charitable causes. He gave money to hospitals, to educational institutions, to religious organizations. He did this quietly, without seeking recognition or publicity. It was one of his characteristics that when he wanted to do good, he did so without trumpeting it. Perhaps this was genuine philanthropy. Perhaps it was an attempt to balance the scales, to counteract the public perception of him as purely motivated by greed. Perhaps it was both. During the 1880s and 1890s, the economy of the United States underwent a series of severe disruptions. There were financial panics and recessions. There were industrial disputes and labor upheavals. Workers were organizing in ways they never had before. The Knights of Labor, the American Federation of Labor, and other organizations were pushing for better wages, shorter hours, safer working conditions. The old order of capital and labor was being challenged in fundamental ways. Gould's railroads were sites of conflict during this period. The workers on his lines went on strike repeatedly. Conditions remained poor. Wages remained low. The chasm between what railroad workers earned and what railroad owners accumulated grew wider. In Gould's mind, this was simply the market at work, workers and owners negotiating the terms of employment. If workers did not like the wages, they were free to work elsewhere. If they chose to strike, that was their choice, but they must accept the consequences of that choice. This was capitalism in its pure form, untouched by sentiment or sympathy. But the American public was beginning to develop a different view. They were beginning to believe that there were certain basic standards that should be guaranteed to workers, that capital should have some obligations to labor, that the accumulation of fortune should have some limits. These ideas were radical in the 1880s and 1890s. They were not widely accepted, but they were spreading, and they made men like Gould, men who embodied pure, unconstrained capitalism, increasingly unpopular. In his quiet house on Fifth Avenue, among his books and his orchids, separated from the workers whose labor made his wealth possible, Gould may or may not have understood how the world was beginning to change around him. He was 60 years old. He had perhaps a decade to live. The 19th century was entering its final years. The 20th century, with all of its different assumptions about capital and labor, about profit and ethics, about what a man owed to his society, that century was beginning to dawn. In the final years of his life, Jay Gould withdrew from business almost entirely. The tuberculosis that had haunted him, though we cannot say he was haunted by it because he seems not to have complained about it, was progressing. He spent time with his family. He read. He tended to his orchids. He was 60 years old, an age at which many men might begin to think of death, though he seems not to have done so openly or in any recorded way. On December 2nd, in the year 1892, Jay Gould died. He died at his home on Fifth Avenue, with his family around him, of tuberculosis. He was 56 years old, which is young by modern standards, but not uncommon for the era. His fortune was estimated at something between $70 and $100 million. The exact amount was never determined, and depended greatly on how one valued various railroad holdings and properties. Adjusted for inflation, this would equal somewhere between $1.5 and $3 billion in the money of later centuries. It was an enormous fortune, the product of 50 years of relentless, brilliant acquisition and manipulation. His funeral was attended by many of the leading businessmen of the country, by politicians, by railroad magnates and financiers. The newspapers, of course, covered his death extensively. The tone of many of the obituaries was ambivalent. He had been a great man in his way. He had been ruthless. He had been corrupt, or at least had operated in ways that ethical people found troubling. He had accumulated an enormous fortune. He had also, by some accounts, improved the railroads he controlled. He had expanded the telegraph network. He had employed thousands of people. He had been a businessman of genuine talent and sophistication, and yet the dominant narrative, the story that emerged from the obituaries and the recollections of those who knew him, was of a cold, calculating man without sympathy or sentiment, a man who had used his intellect to dominate others, a man who had proven that in a capitalist society it was possible to accumulate wealth without regard to ethics or the suffering of others. He was a villain because he had proven something that Americans were beginning to understand, something that made them deeply uncomfortable, that the system they had built allowed for men like him to flourish, and that the system itself might be flawed. His will left his estate to his family. His eldest son, George, took over much of his railroad interests. The fortune would be dissipated somewhat over the years, as it was divided among his children and grandchildren, as taxes grew higher, as the 20th century brought new regulations to corporate America. But for decades, the Gould name remained synonymous with wealth and power. The orchids he had spent so much time tending, the ones that had brought him perhaps the only kind of peace he ever knew, were eventually scattered. Some were given to botanical institutions, Some disappeared. Some were sold. None of them outlived him by much longer than a human might outlive them. The flowers bloomed, faded, and died, as flowers do, indifferent to ownership. The railroad system he built, the system that ran through Texas and Kansas and Missouri and the Southwest, persisted for much longer. It was consolidated, reorganized, broken up, and reorganized again, as railroads always are. But the basic infrastructure, the fact of connections between cities, the ability of trains to carry goods and people across great distances, this remained long after Gould was dead. It is possible to say that he had improved the world in this way, that he had advanced the expansion and integration of the American economy, that he had played a necessary role in the development of the country. It is also possible to say that he had exploited workers, that he had manipulated markets to his benefit and at the cost of others, that he had shown that a man of sufficient intelligence and moral flexibility could accumulate enormous wealth by gaming the system. Both things are true. What is perhaps most remarkable about Jay Gould, looking back now across more than a century, is how little he changed. He was born into modest circumstances, grew up frail and bookish, taught himself surveying and mathematics, went bankrupt once, and then spent the rest of his life accumulating wealth and power. His basic approach to business: identify an undervalued asset, improve its efficiency, sell when it has appreciated, and move to the next opportunity, remained consistent from his earliest days to the end of his life. He did not mellow with age. He did not develop a philosophy of philanthropy or social responsibility. He did not repent or apologize. He simply lived according to his nature, accumulated what he accumulated, and died when his body gave out. The question of whether his life was good or bad, whether he was a villain or a titan or some combination of the two, was answered differently by different people in his own time, and has been answered differently by different historians since. What can be said with certainty is that he was unique. He achieved things that few men in any era have achieved. He accumulated more than almost anyone who came before or after him. He shaped the physical infrastructure of America, the railroads, the telegraph network, in ways that persist to this day. He also caused suffering. He also proved that it was possible to succeed in his system without scruple. The man himself, the actual human being who lived in the house on Fifth Avenue, who loved his wife and his children, who spent hours among his orchids, who read late into the night by lamplight, that man is harder to judge. He was complex, like all complex men. He was intelligent, certainly. He was ambitious. He was also capable of affection and care, if we can trust the letters that remain. Perhaps the truth is that there is no final answer, no complete judgment that captures the whole of who he was. Perhaps the most that can be said is this: he lived, he accumulated, he died. He left behind wealth and infrastructure, and a name that was famous and reviled in equal measure. And that is what remains. The man himself has faded into history, becoming less and less real with each passing year, until eventually he becomes simply a figure, a story, a cautionary tale told to people who never knew him and who live in a world entirely different from the world he inhabited. And that is what remains. The money passes into other hands or dissipates. The railroads are reorganized and rebuilt. The telegraph wires are torn down. The house on Fifth Avenue still stands, but it is not his house anymore. The orchids are gone. the flowers have died. But the story remains. A boy was born in the hills of Roxbury. He was frail, he was clever, he accumulated, he died. And the world moved on, much as it was before, carrying with it the traces of his passage, too small to be seen, too large to be forgotten. And that is what remains. Sleep well.